I'm joined today by Professor David Brough, who is an emeritus professor of applied mathematics in Johannesburg, South Africa, and is a director of Reasons to Believe Africa. David was elected a Fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society of London at the age of 19. He's the only scientist on the continent of Africa whose research has twice featured on the cover of one of the planet's most prestigious scientific journals, Nature. His resume includes being a visiting astronomer at Harvard University and the Australian National University. He also accompanied Professor Stephen Hawking to meet Nelson Mandela. David is married to Elizabeth, and they have 3 adult sons, Aaron, Tevye, and Nathaniel. My second guest is Philip Yancey, one of the best-selling contemporary Christian authors. Philip's books have sold more than 15 million copies in English and have been translated into 40 languages. 2 of his books have won the ECPA's Christian Book of the Year Award, the Jesus I Never Knew book from 1996, and his 1998 publication, What's So Amazing About Grace. Philip is published by Hachette, HarperCollins Christian Publishing, InterVarsity Press, and Penguin Random House, some of our planet's most legendary Christian publishers. Philip Yancey has interviewed 2 US presidents and other notable people such as Bono, Billy Graham, and the authors Annie Dillard, John Updike, and Henri Nouwen. Former US President Jimmy Carter called Yancey my favorite modern author. Join me, your host, Andy Brough, as I chat to Philip and David about God, the galaxies, and grace.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Well, Philip, David, it's just a real joy to have you both with me on the podcast today. And Philip, I want to take you right into something that you wrote in your book, Where is God When It Hurts? As we look back on the speck of eternity that was the history of this planet, we'll be impressed not by its importance, but by its smallness. From the viewpoint of the Andromeda Galaxy, the holocaustic destruction of our entire solar system will be barely visible. A match flaring faintly in the distance and then imploding in permanent darkness. Yet for this burnt-out match, God sacrificed himself. Tell me about that, Philip. Tell me about what you were thinking as you penned those words in that such well-received publication.
Best estimates I've heard lately from astronomers is that there may be as many as 2 trillion galaxies in the universe.
We simply don't know, hey, Philip. It's incredible.
Yeah, I mean, there was an experiment with the Hubble Space Telescope where every time the Hubble orbited Earth, it would zero in, focus in on one little tiny speck that was completely dark. And they wondered if we keep looking at this speck, maybe there's something there after all. And I'm talking about a speck, if you hold a grain of sand out at arm's length, that's the size that they were photographing. And you can Google it and just look up the extreme deep field or the ultra deep field, and you'll find that in that speck we thought was dark, was nothing, were 10,000 galaxies. 10,000 galaxies, each one with maybe 100 billion to 200 billion stars. And here we are, one of 2 trillion galaxies, one of several 100 billion stars in the Milky Way galaxy, our home, this tiny little planet orbiting around this one sun. And yet the story that we get in the Bible is that God gave himself for that planet. He joined us on planet Earth, and that is the paradigm of what grace is all about. A God for God so loved the world that he gave his only son. Even back in the Psalms, in Psalms 8, they're wondering, what are human beings that you even care about us, that you even know that we exist? But the story we have is that God is a God of infinite love. And this entire experiment of planet Earth was an exercise of love. God is love, but you've got to have something to love. Love doesn't exist on its own. It needs an object.
Here we have Pope Urban VIII, who defended this viewpoint to the hilt, that everything orbits the Earth. We call that the geocentric universe, that everything orbits the Earth. Then suddenly the Earth is being displaced because, as you point out in that beautiful piece and in other blogs read by Andy, is that the Andromeda galaxy came next. So man was being dethroned yet more. And now, of course, the Hubble Deep Field, and then the James Webb Space Telescope, looking back, some 14 billion years in time. So we've really been dethroned over and over again. Would you regard that as a rather humbling experience for us, Philip?
You could look at it that way. On the other hand, I would see it as an ennobling experience, that God does care about us. And that's what the psalmist is marveling at. I can't believe that God even cares about us, but we're told that God cares about us so much that he became one of us to rescue us and to redeem the earth and to restore it to the planet that God had in mind with creation in the first place. So you can look at it either way, as humiliation or as ennoblement.
I think that in John chapter 1, one just got such a beautiful description of, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word, was with God, and the Word was God. All things, including the galaxy behind me, NGC 628, I believe, is all things were made by him, and not any one thing was made without him. And as Andy has read in that lovely clip of yours, we beheld his glory, and we beheld grace and truth. How do you see that all playing out? Grace and truth, because in the Old Testament, it's always kind of wrath and truth.
Right. Well, let me talk about how it plays out in church history, because last I heard, there were 45,000 different denominations in the world. And the reason there are 45,000 is that there used to be only 44,999. And then some man, usually a man, got the idea, I know a little bit more truth than all the rest, so I'm going to start my own denomination. So the church has done a really good job working on that truth angle. We have church councils, we have creeds, we have agreements of what we believe, that you have to sign statements of faith to work as a pastor in many denominations. But as John said, Jesus came full of grace and truth. And I keep writing about grace because I wish the church worked as hard to express God's grace and God's love and God's mercy as we have worked to discover God's truth. Truth is important, for sure. But grace is the means in which we are attracted to the truth and get to know the God. The old Shema prayer, God is full of mercy and grace. God is love. Jews used to say that every day. And
the Shema, yes. Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, and God is one.
Absolutely. Good job, David.
Well, I was raised as an Orthodox Jew, as Andy knows.
Philip, as I read your memoir, and what a beautiful piece of writing that is, you talk about these two main themes, the one of suffering, and your book and your life depicts a lot of that, but you also talk about the grace that you've referred to. For people who may not have read your writings, how do you square up this God of sovereignty and the world of pain in which we find ourselves, and much of the pain that you write so vulnerably about in many of your books, and particularly in this fantastic memoir?
Yes, I did finally write my secrets in the memoir called Where the Light Fell. And I started writing about suffering just because it was a block to my faith, as it is for many people. They try to square, how can a loving God allow some of the suffering going on in this planet? And I would say we're kind of born with the wrong instincts. We grow up with the wrong instincts. And the church doesn't help. The church often presents God as this scowling judge, just somebody who might be doing something wrong, so God can punish that person. And it's kind of natural. We do something wrong, we start feeling guilt, we start feeling shame, and we assume God is against us. And the same is true when pain happens. When you get a diagnosis of an illness, people immediately think, well, God is punishing me. God does this for me. Well, what we are taught clearly in the Bible is that God created this beautiful, extraordinary planet, but it's not the kind of planet that God truly wanted. It's a broken planet or an invaded planet. It's been spoiled. That's a phrase that C.S. Lewis used to use. It's a good world spoiled, and it is a good world. I was attracted to God by the goodness and the beauties of nature and romantic love and music and those kind of things, positive things that I had not received from the church, but they brought me back to the church when I wanted to know the God who created those things. What I learned about suffering, I learned primarily from Jesus. And what I learned is that God is always on the side of the sufferer, not against the sufferer, not causing the pain. Jesus never gave a lecture when somebody came to him with whether it was a person who's lame or a person who's blind, no matter what. He never said, okay, now go back and get your theology straight, and then maybe God will like you, and then maybe I will heal you. What he said was, God wants you well. I have not come to solve the problem of pain on earth, but I'm going to give you enough signs so that you realize that one day my Father plans to restore this planet to the original ideal of what it should be. And John, the book of John, constantly calls those signs. They're signs of what God can do. So it's important to realize that God is on the side of the one suffering. And God is no more pleased with the things that happen on planet Earth than we are. You think of the things going on in the world right now, in the Middle East and in Ukraine, and how upset we are. And if only we could solve those things. And God has kind of the same attitude. God is not happy about what's going on, and God does plan to restore that earth one day. Jesus gave us the signs and the proof that God has the ability to address those issues and will someday. But while we're living here, it's important to realize if you want to know what God is like or how God feels about what you're going through, just follow Jesus around and see how he handles people who are suffering. A widow who has just lost her only son, or even a Roman soldier, an enemy soldier whose servant has grown ill. Every time Jesus is confronted with a situation like that, he applies mercy and grace and forgiveness and love and healing. And that is a picture of God that we see in Jesus, and it's a symbol of what's going to happen in a cosmic sense someday.
In fact, Philip, you're right. The New Testament presents suffering as a bad thing. Jesus, after all, devoted himself to acts of healing, yet one that can be redeemed. And then you say, we have hope that on this broken planet, pain can somehow can be useful, even redemptive. Does that mean we just end up waiting until he comes back, or can we live in the now of the victory of kingdom life?
Mm-hmm.
It's a great question. And I'm a journalist. I've been at this for almost 50 years now. And one day I sat down and just reviewed all the people that I've interviewed and written stories about. And there are some people who just seem to have an easy life, and they're successful, they're prosperous, and things seem to come easily for them. And there are other people who just struggle and have problems with their children or have problems with their personal health, and life just seems to be a great struggle. And yet, as I look back on those people, I find it's more likely that the latter group, the group who struggles, that they are the ones who are better stewards of their gifts. Their gifts are, in some cases, suffering or family dysfunction and those kinds of things. And that's a pattern that you see all the way through the Bible. If you go back to the Old Testament and you look at the kings and one queen of Israel, a reigning queen, when things were going well, when they were winning their wars, when the country was relatively prosperous, again and again, the prophets say they forgot about God. They forgot about God. It's when they were going through hard times that they would cry out to God. And that seems to be kind of a pattern among most of us. And when I look back on the people that I've interviewed, the ones who impressed me are the ones who redeemed their pain, allowed God to redeem their pain. That's a pattern that I see. We don't get a promise that God will take away whatever problems you run into. Quite the opposite. In fact, Jesus said, expect difficulties. You live on a broken, expect persecution even. But we do have the promise that God can take bad things and turn them into good things. I like to call God the great recycler. And all over the world, Christians wear this little cross emblem around their necks. And think about that, the execution of God's own son, the worst thing that could happen in history. And it's a day that we call Good Friday, not Bad Friday, Dark Friday, Sad Friday, Tragic Friday, but Good Friday, because God took this thing that looked like the worst thing that could possibly happen and turned it into a great good, the salvation of the earth and the ultimate defeat of death, as shown in the resurrection that happened a few days later. And that's the pattern. We have the promise, not that God's going to solve every problem for us, but that God can use even those problems. And when I wrote my own biography, there are a lot of things growing up that I wish were different or did at the time, but now I can see how, as Paul said, they can all fit together in a way that God can use them to make us more into the kind of people God wants us to be.
For you, how do you square that up with your faith, David?
It's a very difficult question to answer, Andy, because it's a very personal question. I see it as follows. In Japan, you have a ceramic bowl, for example, left as part of the will, say, by your great-grandmother or by your grandmother, and then suddenly it falls. Now, do you toss it away? No, you can't toss it away because you want to keep the memory alive of every single moment of being with your grandmother. And so what the Japanese have mastered is a way of fixing the cracks with gold vein. They actually use lacquer and gold powder, gold vein, and you can actually see these restored objects in Japan. And I know, Philip, you wrote a preface to this book, Art and Faith, I'm holding in front of me, by Fujimura. So I think that's how I see the world, Andy, is I see it as a very broken world, and I see that God is here, just as he was when I was so bullied in high school. God is here, and my world was broken then, finished. My world in high school was totally shattered, which is why on the cover of my book on bullying, you've got a profile of David Block with shattered glass. My world was totally shattered. There's a story to that. Just like with the ceramic bowl from the beloved grandmother, there's a story to that. Now, does God toss us away? No, God doesn't toss us away. But he puts the pieces together in such a way that the scars are the most visible in the restored pot and lacquer. It's, to me, a very beautiful image. I think it's in the Psalms we read, we are broken vessels, says the psalmist. And that's how I always feel. But thank God, by his grace, he doesn't throw the bowl away, doesn't throw Dave Block away, or any one of us away. He restores us moment by moment, and it becomes a glorious, harmonious piece of art. Pascal was very big on this. L'esprit de finesse, the spirit of finesse, the spirit of the great restorer. I mean, Philip wrote so much about this, even in his book with Dr. Paul Brand. He's the great restorer of the broken vessel. Everyone has got a broken heart, I believe. And that's why God says he telleth the numbers of the stars by name. He healeth who? He healeth the broken in heart. And so we are all vessels broken. And through the crucifixion, through the resurrection, and through the Holy Spirit, now he restores us moment by moment. That's actually how I see it. I don't know if you want to add to that, Philip or Andy.
Well, I love that symbol as well. And you don't know this, David, but I participated in the 20th anniversary of the Columbine shootings at Columbine High School, which kind of started this terrible parade of school shootings in the United States over the last 20 years. And Mako Fujimura was there. I spent
Wow.
with
Wow.
Mako, and
Wow.
Mako presented a kintsugi bowl that he had made with the molten gold, putting this
Oh, wow.
100-year-old bowl back together. He presented it to the school where it's displayed in the case
Mm-hmm.
inside the school
Mm-hmm.
right now.
Wow.
And it was just a beautiful picture because one after one, various high school kids in when it happened 20 years ago came up and gave their stories about how they had been shattered by this experience and had gone through all sorts of therapy and one good friend of mine had her shoulder blown off and she trained as a nurse, but then she wasn't able to do it for very long, and she just wrestled with those problems. And then they would always reflect, and this is how God used it in my life and in the
Mm,
lives of others, because
mm,
people were well known. The victims at Columbine were pretty well known, and she would get stopped in the grocery store or at a petrol station, and and that became her witness. That became her life work, to bearing witness that
mm,
despite tragedy,
mm.
tragedy itself can be used for good. And the kintsugi bowl ceremony that I participated in, it was a beautiful symbol of that.
Well, I never knew about that, because in this book, Art and Faith, which you so brilliantly endorsed, he's got little chapters on the kintsugi, as an art form, the beauty of brokenness. Now, Philip, this is true. When I switch on the news, we live in such a broken world. As you alluded to earlier, C.S. Lewis, the world is shattered, the world is broken, but we have a restorer with a capital R, whose presence we can seek every single day. And I think that's the truth to bring to people. I live in South Africa, as you well know, Philip. Andy and I are both in South Africa. And I remember certain theologians, in particular the late Johann Haynes, and he was the leader of the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa. And eventually he said, I've carried this theology for many decades, but as the head of the NG Church in South Africa, but apartheid is a sin. That's what he said. Now, I was sitting in his lounge 2 weeks before he was assassinated on that very lounge. He was sitting with his grandchildren. Sniper came along and killed him. My point is that, and what I love about your writing so much, which Andy so brilliantly alluded to as well, is that you seek out the God who restores, who doesn't divide, who doesn't say, race X here, race Y there, who doesn't delight, God forbid, in ever sending people to hell. You read this, but it's not right. It's theology can become God's greatest obstacle. And in the art of kintsugi, you don't see this at all. Would you like to elaborate on that, Philip?
Yes, you mentioned a South African theologian. Well, just last week, I don't know exactly when this will be broadcast, but we're talking in June of 2024. And just last week, one of my favorite theologians, Jürgen Moltmann, died. He was 98 years old, and
Yes.
some say he was the most widely read theologian of the 20th century. And I got to meet him, and I heard his story. I'd read about it and spent an evening with him hearing his story in person. He was drafted by the Nazi army when he was 16 years old. His whole high school class was sent to man the anti-aircraft batteries. And then Hamburg was firebombed, and his best friends were killed all around him. And as soon as he could, because it was obvious that the cause was lost, there was no way Germany could win the war. So as soon as he could, he ran up to a British soldier and said, "I surrender, I surrender, I surrender." And they took him to a prison camp, and he expected to be treated like dirt, but he wasn't. In fact, it was a camp that was partly run by the YMCA. And these Scottish women would bring home baked goods and somebody gave him a New Testament and Psalms. When he went into the German army, all he had was the works of Goethe and Nietzsche, and they weren't really doing much for him in that prison camp there. But he started reading the Bible really for the first time, and he felt a stirring of hope. And there was a chapel, a little tiny chapel in that prison camp on top of the hill, and he would circle the camp just trying to stay in shape, physical shape, and see that hut, that little chapel on the top of the hill, and it inspired hope in him. And as he started reading, he realized maybe our planet is like that as well. There are a lot of bad things going on, but somehow we're asked to maintain hope and to believe that there is also goodness and there can be restoration one day. So he founded this whole theology of hope. That was his first book, The Theology of Hope.
I remember that, yes.
Yeah. And then along that same line, his most famous book maybe is a book called The Crucified God, which again speaks to that unbelievable descent in which the God of the universe, the God of 2 trillion galaxies, became one of us. Some people translate that verse in John. It said he tabernacled among us. He pitched his tent among us. God became one of us, a fellow pilgrim on this earth.
Quote Richard Seltzer, and I wanted to ask you about this notion of the writer, and I talk to you as a fellow author, who attempts to bring the wound of childhood with words, knowing that all the while, should the wound heal, he would no longer be a writer. What would you say to those who somewhat skeptically might think that that's really what your business has been? It's just writing about pain, because the more you do that, the more it gives you a sense of identity, that ultimately, if there was no pain, you'd have nothing to write about. What is your response? What is your response to that?
Well, what surprised me when I first started writing about pain, like most people, I immediately thought of pain as the enemy. If only we had a world without pain, what a great world that would be. And then I found quite to the contrary in my work with Dr. Paul Brand that pain is actually a gift. In fact, we once titled a book, Pain, the Gift That Nobody Wants. And it became the book that nobody wants. So we retitled it The Gift of Pain, and then that's done better. And he was the one who established for all time that virtually, indeed, all of the damage that you see and we associate with the disease leprosy comes because they don't feel pain. So a very simple illustration, about a third of people with leprosy go blind. They go blind because we have this tiny little pain cell in our eye that makes us blink every few seconds. You blink thousands of times a day. We don't even think about it. If you do think about it, if you say, okay, I'm just going to stop blinking here and hold my eye like this, you'll feel excruciating pain rather shortly. Your eye will dry out and it's telling you, I want to blink, I want to blink. Well, a person with leprosy doesn't have that pain cell working. And so he doesn't blink, she doesn't blink, and about a third of them go blind because their eyes dry out. And Dr. Brand said, if I had one gift I could give my leprosy patients, it would be the gift of pain. So what I learned, and it's very parallel to what we've been talking about in an almost theological way, is that things that we think are bad for us can actually be used for our good. They keep us alive. They keep us healthy.
That's powerful.
Yeah. At a cellular level, in fact, all through your body, you have pains that organs feel that are specific to that organ. So that, for example, you feel the pain of gas if you have an intestinal problem and you feel gas, and it can be excruciating. But you could actually, if you could go through the skin without causing pain, you could cut your intestine with a knife and you would feel nothing, because that's not a danger. Your body only has pains to protect the particular danger of the part that is at risk. So even things that we want to say there's no use for this, it's kind of a waste, what a mistake. The more you look at it, the more you realize that we really are fearfully and wonderfully made, and our entire universe is fearfully and wonderfully made. At the same time, it has been corrupted, it has been spoiled, And we have the promise that God can take even those broken parts and put them back.
It's so powerful because that's the God I know, Philip, and Andy is the God who delight. The Lord is my shepherd; I shall not want. Isn't that a glorious verse? In times of adversity or pain, that He's actually gone before me in the pain. He doesn't decry the pain. He doesn't decry the story of suffering. I was at Auschwitz. He doesn't decry. I'll never forget Philip placing my hand on the wall where so many Jews were shot dead. The actual wall, not the gas chambers, but the actual wall. And I put my hand on it, and for about 3 minutes, I couldn't take it off. It was as if the Holy Spirit of God was so much feeling the pain of the people who had suffered that He wouldn't allow me to take my hand. It was like a magnet on that wall. It's only about 3 minutes I felt I could pull it away. Such was the presence of God in my hand, identifying with pain. And I think that's what's so important in all of this discussion is God is the God of ultimate pain.
Yeah. And of ultimate healing, and God can use those difficult times. I have spent time just reading through the transcripts of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission
Yes.
in South Africa, and what an example of a painful time that it was. It's so hard to go back and hear that testimony, to read it, and yet that's an important step in healing. If you keep covering up the wound, it will never heal. You have to let it out into the light. And it was Archbishop Tutu,
yes,
and knowing that's a stage my country needs to go through. It's not a pleasant stage; it's a painful stage, but it's an important step toward reconciliation, toward healing, which is the ultimate goal, and which is that hope that we have as Christians. The reason we have that hope is because God lived it out in front of us, becoming one of us, dying, and yet taking that terrible tragedy and turning it into the greatest triumph of the universe, really.
So really what you're saying is that God is the God of putting together, as in Kintsugi, the broken pieces, the brokenness. In South Africa, so much brokenness between white and black, and every race really is extreme brokenness. But I remember Stephen Hawking, said, he said, religion, as he called it, Christianity, as he called it, is for those afraid of the dark. He believed that we were just computers, and at the moment of death, the computer gets switched off. And I replied saying, no, 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 no. Atheism is for those afraid of the light. And I think that's what Archbishop Tutu tried to do is don't be afraid of exposing your scars. Don't be afraid of the light.
That's beautiful, wonderful.
So, Philip, what are your thoughts on the Ministry of Reasons to Believe Africa, and how do you see it contributing to the discourse in terms of apologetics and helping people to work out their faith in a really practical way?
I think especially of young people who are raised in a very conservative church, and they're taught the earth is only a few thousand years old, and there are no such things as dinosaurs. And then they go to university and they find out, actually there are a lot of evidences of dinosaurs around the world, and the age of the earth, this light comes to us from other planets thousands of years ago, millions of years ago, light years ago. And it becomes a crisis of faith. But there's a gentleman in the United States, Francis Collins is his name. He's a great scientist. He headed up the Human Genome Project. And he was so concerned about this that he formed an organization called BioLogos, biology, life, and logos, the word. And precisely to address that issue. And actually, people who are interested can go on, much like Reasons to Believe. I'm sure you have many resources that they can cruise through at their own speed and level. and Biologos also has that. And Francis Collins picks up what is kind of an ancient phrase. Some of the early people like Augustine talk about the two books of God, the book of nature and the Bible. Those
Correct.
are the two books of God.
Correct.
And they believe they don't conflict.
Mm.
It's God, it's the same speaker. God is the speaker in both cases. And both of them require a good bit of study to understand them. And just a simple reading of quantum physics or a simple reading of the Bible really doesn't do much for you. You have to dig into it and really understand the context and the background and all that. But the effort is worth it. And it especially is worth it when you realize that the same creator behind the incredible universe we live in is a creator who loved us and has given us a manual, really, of why the earth exists and what God wants from us on that earth, what kind of people we should be, not only in the words of the Bible, but the Logos himself, Jesus becoming the Word, becoming one of us, walking among us, so that if we want to know what is God like, we just look at Jesus. What should we be like? Just look at Jesus. That's the key.
Thank you,
Beautiful.
Philip, as I read your memoir, you were also very vulnerable about the challenges at the level of family relationships. You talk deeply about the strained relationship with your own mother. You talk about the challenge of your relationship with your brother, Marshall. As you think back on that now, what would be your message to people of faith and people who are maybe looking for faith as to how they reconcile that with the pain of families, where in many cases relationships aren't what they might be?
Yeah, well, we could talk a long time about that. I I must say, I waited for most of my life. Here I am in my 70s. I waited to tell these stories because I was afraid that it would only contribute further to the pain of my family. It was a small family, a single mother and two boys, my older brother and me, and a lot of dysfunction in that family, which you can read about. I was afraid that by just telling this truth, by exposing it in the light, I would hurt and make it worse. And actually, the reverse happened. My mother and brother had not had any contact, zero contact, for 52 years. They had not heard each other's voice. They had not seen each other. They lived a continent away, one in Georgia in the eastern United States, the other in California, as far west as you could get. And yet when I wrote it, it became an opportunity to bring things into the light. And the last year of my mother's life, she died at age 99, just a year ago. The last year, I had them together on 4 different telephone conversations across the continent, but the only times they had heard each other's voice. And finally, to my astonishment, my brother sent a card, had 3 words on the card. It said, "I forgive you." And when you read what he had to forgive, it was quite an astonishing statement. He's had a broken life, and yet it was shining the light and bringing it into the light, and trying to apply grace and trying to apply some early stages of reconciliation that made that possible. So I guess my message to a family like that is you don't try it on your own. Don't practice this at home. Make sure that you've got a supportive community around you, perhaps a pastor or a church group who can give you feedback, who can give you some guidance and how much to do. And we tend to want to go too fast. We want to. Somebody told me that they learned a lot about grief from scuba diving. You can go very deep when you scuba dive, but the deeper you go, the slower it takes to come back. Or otherwise, your arteries are going to explode. You just can't do that. You can't take that change in pressure. And he said Christians try to get people back to the surface too soon. And so to be wise helpers, we need to be sensitive And again, I waited 50 some years to actually get my mother and brothers speaking again. But a lot was going on. But toward the end there, I think God answered some of those prayers that we've been praying for decades.
It's so powerful. So powerful and so touching, because it reiterates over and over again that God is not finished with us, but at the end of the day, He's going to present to us a magnificent, as it were, ceramic bowl of ourselves, yet again, coming back to Fujimura, the wonder of the completion of it all. And you know what's very interesting also is that we shall see, by God's grace, the scars of the risen Christ. They're not removed. They're not removed. It was Thomas who had to put his hands, and he said, lest I put my hands into his side. And Jesus allowed him to touch those scars. He was pierced, sides and in the feet and so forth, suffering excruciating pain. But the point is, the best is yet to come. To reveal the scars takes the greatest degree of courage. But unless we come to the light, there is essentially very, very little hope. You know, Philip, without going into any detail whatsoever, my dreams were smashed in the early 2000s. And you know the story of what happened with regard to Star Watch and the heavens declare the glory of God. And, you know, I sat there, Philip, and you were one of the only ones at the time who fed me with the theology of hope, the power of the resurrection. The best is yet to come. Because you had got I remember you told me you had purchased my very first book, Star Watch. Is that correct? In the early 1980s.
In the UK, I got that, yes.
That's incredible. So I think that, just before handing back to Andy, is that God is the God who allows the deepest of pains. But if it wasn't for pain, as you point out, the leper would feel nothing. And how easy was it for you to actually write, to become, as Andy says, so vulnerable to you? I mean, you were at the cutting edge of not speaking to your mom for so many years, as I recall, and then your brother. And how did you descend to such depths and yet come up again with such grace, like the divers do?
My wife worried about that. I often will go out into the mountains. I live in Colorado, a mountainous state, and I go to a little place where I do my writing just away from the telephone and computers and all that. And she would know what I'm going to be writing about that week. And when I would come home, she would say, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" And my answer was always yes. It was, writing is a way of putting things together, of metabolizing, of seeing how they fit together, how bad things can actually be used for good. And I had experienced that in my life and experienced it in my family. And so it was a healthy exercise. And
now, Philip, a lot of people are retiring. You know, I head up, I'm director of Reasons to Believe in Africa. And a lot of people who follow us are age 60, 65 in South Africa. You have to retire at age 65. I'd love you also, because this is going to be watched by multitudes around the world, is that what, not theology, but what personal advice can you give to a Christian brother or sister who, say, at 65 years old, and they suddenly feel their world is shattered? They've got basically very little to do. Fortunately, you've never suffered from that problem. But, you know, the answer is not going into a retirement village. The answer is to keep the mind astute and active. What advice would you give someone listening who belongs to that age group, Philip?
My wife came up with, she came across, she can't even remember where she read it, but it's the definition of health. And it goes like this: health is the ability to adapt to life as it happens. And this year, 1 year ago, as I think you know, David, I was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And it's a disease that can affect your body in many scores of ways, actually. And it kind of feels like getting old too quickly. Like I'm going to be losing parts of my body. And so far, medication has controlled most of it, but as each month it rolls along, I have a new challenge that I have to face. And I think if you go through life thinking, okay, I've worked hard, so now I'm going to just enjoy pleasure. I'm going to go to the beach. I'm going to do things, travel, go to places that I've never been before. And something like a Parkinson's or a disease like that comes along, it can be devastating. You could think, well, I'm cheated. Well, actually, we don't have the promise that we're going to get life to orderly, in such an orderly way. Actually, we don't get the ability to determine how our life is going to unfold. And in my case, I'm going to be spending a lot of the next few years just coping with a disease that is degenerative. It gets worse. It doesn't get better. And so my challenge is, how can I find some meaning in that? How can I let God use that in a way that I can maybe help other people who are caregivers? I think of my wife and all she has to do. She doesn't have the disease, but she's affected by it through me. And there are caregivers out there, and I want to reach those caregivers. I can write about my experience, and hopefully in a way that can give some guidance to them. So I just go back to that definition of health, to adapt to life as it happens. And as Christians, we believe that somehow or other God is behind what happens there, and that God is a God who can take all of those things, good things, bad things, and use them for our own good. And that's my prayer.
It's so beautiful.
And it's our prayer to Philip Yancey and Professor David Brough. I want to thank both of you for the privilege of these moments that we've had together, contemplating God, the galaxies, and grace. Thank you so much.